All right, everybody, welcome again to our new established forum, or our time for sort of what I call large group learning. And although it has nothing really to do with Advent, and I really tried to figure out a way to link it to Advent, and I failed, what we're doing is a two-part series. This is part 2 on archaeology in the Bible because it's fun. And we haven't had a lot of fun this year, and so let's have some fun. So that's why we're doing it. And just the same disclaimer I gave last week, I did spend 20 years as an archaeologist, but I was not a biblical archaeologist. I was a New World archaeologist. I worked in North and South America. Never have I worked in the Near East. And it is kind of a specialized field, a little bit more specialized than what I did. However, I am capable of reading their reports, and I am capable of examining their data and evaluating it. And actually, the whole point of this series, this two-part thing, is actually to help you do the same. So that my goal is more to help you be able to evaluate biblical archaeology claims, or really any archaeological claim that you read in the popular press, because archaeology is fun and it often makes the popular press. And sometimes it's reported very well, and sometimes it's reported badly. And sometimes archaeologists claim they find stuff that maybe they didn't, that they make conclusions that some of us other archaeologists don't think that they can make, which is, the same in every science, really. So, so that's what the point of all of this is. And I'm going to start with just a quick review of what we talked about last time, well, so that anybody who wasn't here last time can get that, and if you were here, it'll refresh your memory. So, and it's about what archaeology is, and what it does well, and what it does not do well. And it's accompanied by pictures of me doing archaeology just to prove that I actually did it. So this is in the Andes. That was really cool. You see the circular feature right here, stone line pit, 2 meters down, which was, I didn't expect to hit. And the unit dropped right on it, and that's really unusual because usually you catch something with a corner of your unit and you have to open up 3 other ones to expose it. Archaeology is in fact a branch of anthropology. My degree is in anthropology. Anthropology is the study of human diversity in all of its forms, and why are we diverse and what does that mean? And it has subfields. So sociocultural anthropology is people who go out and talk to living people. Linguistic archaeology, anthropology is people who study language, human language, and how that changes diversity of language. Physical anthropology is the study of our bodies from a cultural perspective, and archaeology is the study of dead people and dead human diversity. So that's what we do. It is essentially a social science, but it uses material culture, which is stuff. That's just the archaeologist's name for stuff, or houses, or rooms, or churches. This is material stuff, material culture. It uses the physical sciences will be brought into it to analyze materials and things like that. So, and biological sciences as well. Most projects are multidisciplinary, where you have different specialists who work on different aspects of the project to maximize the amount of information you can extract from the ground. And essentially, as I was mentioning, as all anthropology is study of human diversity, archaeology has the advantage of being able to study human diversity across large spatial areas, but most importantly, across long time spans. No one else can do that within the field of any social science, is study human diversity across long time spans. The unfortunate thing is all those people are dead. We can't talk to them. All we can do is look at their trash. But trash is pretty good. Trash tends to not lie. So, and again, the goal of classes help you evaluate archaeological claims, what you read in the press, and that's me at an Inca period site in the Andes, because it's got big, nice walls.
You were skinny.
And I was skinny. I had to walk uphill both ways to get to this site. Just true, because it went up and over a hill. So a couple things archaeology is not good at, if you remember this from the past. Archaeology is not good at finding specific people. Now it does, that every now and then, like a named person. It does every now and then, and it makes a big splash in the news. You should always be dubious about it. They should have a preponderance of evidence, and it's usually only because of a convergence of historical and past information. The finding of, what's his bucket, Richard III. I mean, that only worked because of a lot of things. He had a very distinctive skeletal form because he had a disease that affected the skeleton. They knew where he died. They could correlate that with the ground. They could do all this kind of other stuff. It's really rare because most of the time you don't have any of that information, even if you have a body, right? And so this is actually from Pompeii, where after it was covered in ash and people's bodies were trapped and they then decomposed, you can pour plaster into the cavity and form a person, but we don't know who that was. Could be Pliny the Elder, but we have no idea. So it's very bad at that. It's also really bad at finding specific historical events. Very, very tricky to do that archaeologically. Your data tends to come in like big packages of information over time. Trash pits that record everybody's trash for the past 1,000 years. Buildings that were built and rebuilt, and so, or cities that were built on top of each other. And, any specific historical event's hard to see. I mean, it does happen, but it's pretty rare. Archaeology, however, is very good at, and this is the site of Teotihuacan in Mexico. I'm standing on top of one pyramid, looking towards another pyramid. It's good at reconstructing the past economy because you're finding stuff that moves around, People who are Marxists are materialists, right? And so most archaeologists, in fact, get a lot of their major theory from Marx because it's good about talking about stuff. So ancient economy, identifying and tracking trade. Stuff moves around. We can often figure out where it was made, where it comes from. And it's good at describing economic and social changes over time and space. And that's the main thing. You see differences. You see changes, either across space at the same time or across time in the same spot. So it's very good at that because material culture changes over time, and you can try to interpret that. So again, describing changes in economy and society. This is my lovely wife Heather, standing in a kiva in a site in the southwest that's not mentioned on any maps, but is very well preserved. And then also very good at comparing and contrasting past societies and groups. And also if you are working in a period where people did produce historical documents, it's really good at what does the document say, what does the archaeology say, and sometimes they match and sometimes they don't. And then that tells you something about both things, which is really interesting. So, let's go do some biblical archaeology. So let's start with the thing archaeology is not good at, which is finding a specific person, and let's find Pontius Pilate. We heard about him today, right? And Luke, narrowing down the time period, naming all these people. We do have independent evidence other than the Bible that there was a Pontius Pilate who was governor at the time, right around what we would call the turn of the millennium. So let's see what kind of evidence we have archaeologically for his existence. Oh, this is what I was saying. That's David Bowie in the movie, playing Pilate in the movie Last Temptation of Christ. Best portrayal of Pilate I've ever seen. And probably best acting I've ever seen David Bowie do. Great musician, don't get me wrong. May he rest in peace and rise in glory. He is known from multiple sources of gospel. Philo of Alexandria talks about him. Josephus, who's a historian, was writing right around the same time. And as well as Roman records. They were very good at keeping records, especially what their governors were up to. So we know he existed. And we have one archaeological record, that proves he did, and you're looking at this inscribed stone. And this stone was found in Caesarea Maritima, which is a site on the coast of Israel, what's now Israel, that was in fact the Roman sort of headquarters. Jerusalem was not really their headquarters. Caesarea Maritima was, and that's where Pilate spent most of his time. And then he would go to Jerusalem during big festivals and things like that to kind of keep the peace. And this stone was actually found reincorporated, reused in the theater, the Roman theater. So this stone had been erected somewhere else, broke, fell down, they moved, and then they reused it to build a theater. That's actually really common. And it reads basically, to the divine Augustus, this Tiberian Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated something. So you can see it's broken off. So it's a dedication stone that Pilate and in all of his munificence and beneficence built something, put his name on it, got credit for it, and then whatever it was fell down and they reused the stone. So there is the actual archaeological record. And so this is one thing I think it's interesting. Like, there's all this historical evidence for the existence of Pilate, but it doesn't really show up in the archaeological record except in this one instance, and that's not uncommon. So again, hard to find individual people. John?
How is an inscription differentiated from other historical documents?
I guess it's just terminology. In a way, it's a historical document, and it's, just, is it on paper or papyrus, or is it on stone? And the ones on stone tend to be shorter, so that's what you've got. So let's find someone else. Let's see if we can find someone from Paul's letters, right? Everybody always blows past the end of Paul's letters where he starts thanking people. They're fascinating things in there because he's, talking about people in different. That's where you find evidence that women play real big roles in Paul's communities, because he thanks them and he describes them as in charge of the church or as a deacon and things like that. This is actually the road across Thessalonica. So Paul is the Roman road. Paul is likely to have actually walked on this road at some point. So let's talk about one of these people, Erastus. He shows up in a number of Paul's letter, in one authentic Pauline letter and a letter attributed to Paul, 2 Timothy, and in the book of Acts. So you can see, he's mentioning, Paul writes from Corinth, and he's talking about Erastus. And what these sort of suggest, put together, is that Erastus knew Paul. Paul knew somebody named Erastus. He was a major assistant to him. He was probably from Corinth, and he was probably a wealthy and prominent individual, since he was described as the city's director of public works. So, you didn't just get that, on your talent. You mostly got that because you were rich. So, he actually existed. We know a little bit about him, maybe, depending on how trustworthy these sources are. And guess what? 1929 in Corinth. There's been a lot of archaeological work done in Corinth, from the pre-Roman period, the Roman period, the post-Roman period. And in 1929, in a paved area northeast of the theater, they found this inscription, and it dates to the mid-1st century AD, which is right around when Paul is writing. And what it reads is, Erastus, in return for his aedileship, his being in charge of public works, laid this pavement at his own expense, right? So this is actually not all that uncommon. It's actually the source of the word liturgy. Liturgy in Latin originally meant a public work that you did on behalf of the rest of the community, and it got incorporated as a church term. So this was not unusual. Romans had no problem bragging about what they did. And so, all right, here we have this Erastus, right? That's kind of striking. The font got tiny. Is this Erastus that Paul talks about? Right? Is that him? Or maybe it's his dad? Or maybe it's some other Erastus, right? So, I don't know what you guys think. Is it Erastus from the letters?
Biblical. The language that was crossover that Jesus spoke.
Jesus probably spoke Aramaic.
Aramaic. That's what I thought.
Yeah. So, you're all saying that. I mean, it's hard to say. Yeah, Nate?
I suppose I would want to be looking for some sort of corroborating evidence before making it.
Exactly. There's a little bit, Erastus is described as a director of public works. That's the kind of thing he might have done. Dates to roughly the right period. Now remember, dates kind of aren't precise. They've got an error range on them. So we don't know exactly, and we don't know when Erastus was in charge of public works. And probably the biggest problem is we don't have a phone book from Corinth from the first century that would give us a sense of how common is Erastus as a name, right? We don't know that, right? Erastus might have been a really unusual name, then that would be some good corroborating evidence. It might have been like John or whatever, a really common name. So, you know.
How was this dated?
Actually, that I don't remember. These things are hard to date. My guess would be its association with something else that got dated. So,
well, I would have kind of a negative question in evaluating this. If he was a close associate of Paul, then what would the Romans think about him being in a position of prominence in the city government?
well, you know, at the time it's kind of interesting. Yeah, Christianity was not officially allowed. It was persecuted in some places. It was tolerated in others. So, difficult to say, you know, how...
That would be one of the little doubts in my mind, but
Right.
I would want to maybe find some other evidence to maybe explain that or
rule it out, something like that.
Yeah, right.
Marty?
Is that what their letters look like?
That is, they generally wrote in all caps. Even when writing on a paper or papyrus, they would write in all caps with no spaces and no punctuation.
That's not Greek at all.
No, that's not a Greek, that's a
Greek
Latin.
would be a triangle for that.
Right, yeah, this is Latin.
For D.
So I'm going to move on because there's more examples that I want to get to. So here's a portion of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, and this is a case where I think archaeology does well because it adds some context that helps you interpret texts. So Paul is grousing in this section of the letter about how the Corinthians are eating their liturgical Last Supper meal. And he's saying basically they're doing it badly, there are divisions, there are factions. When you come together, you're not really eating the Lord's Supper because some of you goes ahead with your own supper, one person goes hungry, another person becomes drunk. Do you not have homes to eat or drink in? Or do you show contempt and humiliate those who have nothing, right? Or what should I say to you? Should I commend you? No, I do not. And in fact, he goes on and he thinks some members of the community, they got sick, and he thinks it's because they're doing this really badly. So what is going on here? Well, let's talk about dining in the ancient Roman world. So dining was kind of different. People had a very, especially upper class Romans would have a very specific way of dining. And you can actually see these are dining rooms. And there were little benches that people reclined on. And then I'm not going to show a better picture of this. And what's interesting is these are associated with a pagan temple. So you would often go to the temple, maybe do a sacrifice, and then have like a meal with your clients or anybody you're trying to entertain and that sort of thing. So not unlike taking clients to a box seat at a football game. And there's an archaeological example of one from Pompeii, very well preserved. You can see the inclined benches, and that's kind of an idea of how people would have eaten around the table. So this is the common line. Now, one thing you can see is that you can only get so many people in there, right? This is not like being in here. It's much more private and kind of intimate affair. And now let's talk about eating in a house, in a Roman house, because we do know that most of Paul's churches were house churches. They were people meeting in somebody's house. And if you had a house that they could meet in, you were probably doing okay. But we also know from the way Paul talks in his letters that a whole range of people were coming. Wealthy people, poor people, slaves were coming, things like that, for these celebrations and meals. And you'll know Roman houses, they almost all look like this. It's really kind of funny. You see them, or Roman elite houses, with kind of an interior courtyard, an atrium, and kind of 3 sections. And often, if this was a street, you'd have a couple of stores they would rent out and come into an atrium. This would be open to the sky and have a little pool in the middle of it, very pretty. And then off of it is the dining room, the triclinium, where you would be entertaining guests and clients and things like that. So again, you'll notice kind of a small space and a larger space. So if you try to imagine how were they putting people in here for eating, and this is an example from, I think, Herculaneum, because it's still got a roof. Here's the impluvium, the pool as the water came in, and the dining So what's probably going on, what we can really imagine Paul's talking about, is that the wealthy people get to go in the triclinium and get served by slaves, and everybody else is stuck out here with whatever sack lunch that they can bring, right? And so that's really, he's criticizing this Roman mode of eating and how they've just sort of gone on and incorporated that very unequal, stratified kind of society into their worship of God. And it's like, this is not right? This is, the Lord's Supper, this special meal, is not just about filling yourself up and having a meal. It's about remembering the Last Supper, and you should be doing that equally. And which is really, that provides a lot of context, because most people in the Roman world would have taken that stratification as natural. That's just the way of the world. And so Paul, by attacking basically how people ate in houses and how they did it, is really making a subversive statement about changing the world around, like reinventing the world. All right, I'll stop there for a second, take a question or two before I go on to this one. Yes?
I'm gonna have to speed this up a little bit and go watch Revelations of the Pyramid, explain it in 1 hour.
Oh, okay, all right, well, then we'll try to
I
do
gotta
that.
call my mom, she's in Whitehall, to make sure she makes it 11th Street Church on time and brings my mail.
Okay, we'll do that.
Give you a last, I gotta go.
All right, other questions, anything so far? Okay, that's okay. So this is one that is actually very personally interesting to me, just because it's kind of a puzzle and one that might still yield information down the road. So this is Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which is an entire church built around what was believed to be the tomb where Jesus' body was laid after he was crucified, as well as Golgotha, the rock on which he was crucified. It's a really interesting building. It received many reconstructions. Probably the first was built by the Empress Helena, Constantine's wife, who found the tomb, supposedly, because all of it was deeply buried from when the Romans demolished Jerusalem in 70 AD. And they just literally flattened it and then, pushed things over and filled up the streets. And what you walk on today is the top of that destruction. And so Helena Constantine goes to find this tomb, believes she has found it. It's a great story, I'll tell you later. It involves dead virgins and all kinds of things like that. She believes she finds the tomb. She glorifies it by building a church around it. As time goes on, it burns down, like a lot of these things tend to do. The Crusaders come in. They built most of what you see today as a Crusader church, but it's been modified and tinkered with over the years. Let's just do a little walkthrough. This little structure is called the Edicule. It's the center, the focus, and it's built around what they believe the tomb to be. And that's really kind of perplexing, but I'm going to show you how that works. So it's encapsulating the tomb, and it's like a church within a church. And so you have to kind of imagine what we suspect the original tomb was like. And this is based on, we do know what other tombs from the first century around Jerusalem look like, because we've found a lot of them. So you can see that stone that would have covered the door. This would have been carved into the bedrock, basically. Jerusalem's a very hilly area, and you can carve into the bedrock. You have a stone to block the door. You have benches that you lay a body on. And then this would be like a family tomb. And then over time, as bodies decay, you'd scoop up the bones, you'd put them in an ossuary, and you'd have a bench free for the next person who dies. So they're imagining maybe a small tomb, maybe with one bench, cut into the hillside. Now, here's the key. Here's something that provides maybe a suggestion that this might actually be true. So Jerusalem at the time of Jesus had a Roman wall around it. This is the temple. Here's the Roman wall, well, the Jerusalem wall coming around it. And here's where the description of the crucifixion was, just outside the wall, kind of in a quarry, kind of dumpy area. The Romans would have liked to crucify people by gates, because as people come into the city, they're going to get a warning about behaving in the Roman way, and what happens if you don't. And by everything we know from the Gospels and everything, his crucifixion took place outside the walls. You really wouldn't do it inside the walls anyway. Oops, So again, here's a map, showing the walls of that time and various features. And again, the traditional, the spot of the Holy Sepulchre is outside the walls. Now, here's what's interesting. By 325, this we got Council of Nicaea, Constantine is making Christianity okay. Jerusalem has changed a lot, and they built another wall on the outside, right? So this is the time when Helena, Constantine, and company would have been looking for this tomb, and lo and behold, it's inside the walls. It's really not a spot you would normally, you were like, well, it should be outside the walls. And they didn't have, like, records or plaques on the walls that said this was 325 AD, not 0, So they didn't really know. So, and kind of the sequence of events is that Hadrian, the emperor, built a temple to Aphrodite that was witnessed by Eusebius, who writes some early church history. And he built it on top of this spot, which is really kind of interesting. Why would he do that? The bishop of Jerusalem asked permission at the Council of Nicaea to excavate for a tomb. Helena of Constantine is with him. They find a tomb and note that it's inside the walls at the time. And their interest was based on Christian memories and attestation of where it was. But remember, 200 years has gone by easily at this point. And so, how good is that memory? That's like great-grandparents passing stuff on. But again, man, why did Hadrian there was no reason for a temple there. And Romans often dropped temples on spots people were venerating, right? Because that was an easy way to show who was in charge. So now, trying to imagine that tomb within the 4th century church that would have been built, it was, from what we can tell, it was something like this. That you had the church, you had an antechamber, you had Christ's tomb that they had kind of, built in, but, it's incorporating this rock, and in fact, they're cutting it away in order to expose it, as well as the rock of Golgotha. And that's why you get this weird-looking edicule. They basically cut all the rock away around what they believe to be Christ's tomb, and they built this building, which has a little entry chapel, and then this thing and this bench is supposedly the tomb where he lay. Now, so again, here's some hypothesized ways that it could have developed there, and then you cut away, and in there's still some of the rock, right, that they've incorporated. We don't know. There's been an edicule there for so long that we have no idea what it actually originally looked like, and nobody wrote down the process. They just did it. Or if they wrote it down, we don't have the document anymore. So then that edicule got reconstructed a variety of times over the centuries, and this is kind of showing a hypothesized where we think, except for that one, the black, the kind of stippled stuff here, might be original rock. Might still be intact around it. And here's a current form done with a really good map. Another funny story I'll try to tell quickly. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is managed by like 4 or 5 different religious groups, Syrian Orthodox, etc. There's a bunch of Ethiopian monks who live on the roof, no joke, and they don't like each other. And so they worked out this really complicated agreement in the 1850s or so, and they basically froze the place in time. And nobody touches anything. There's like trash in the corners from that time that they don't touch, that don't move. The problem is that edicule is beginning to fall apart. So they were sort of aware they were going to have to come to some agreement of what to do about it. And they did agree to have an archaeologist come and do a detailed study, a detailed map, things like that in preparation for doing these repairs. And that's what, he produced this map. So, really good mapping from the inside, from the outside. And so you see the antechamber, and then this kind of weird slanting off a little bit, and that's the bench. And then this is the outside of the edicule, and so supposedly, maybe there's rock in there. So, just a shot. So this is very interesting to me, not just as an archaeologist, but as someone who does historic preservation. Like nobody made any attempt to preserve this as it looked. The goal was to glorify it, right? Make it more impressive. So you're looking at marble and stuff that's been, plunked on top of the original stone in order to make it more impressive, right? So there was no goal for you to be able to experience what going to Jesus' tomb was like. It was like, no, you want to glorify this, right? So you've got that outside chapel, the angel they call it. There's a door going into the individual tomb. So here's all right, first of all, we have the question. What does the evidence suggest to you as to how strong of an argument that we can make that this is Jesus' tomb? Go ahead, Heather.
Did they find the shroud of Turin there?
No, that cropped up somewhere in Italy, Middle Ages, I want to say. So no, it wasn't found in there. Go ahead, Rob. Yes, Rob.
So there must have been hundreds of other tombs pocketed in that zone, right?
Yeah, oh yeah. And they just blasted through them.
Right, so this just happens to be one that was intact.
Well, we don't know, right? We don't know why this one was picked, right? I'll get to maybe a theory I have that's one that could be, in fact, confirmed or not confirmed, but actually tested at least.
Have there been any mystics to go in there to say, hey, this is cool?
I'm sure there have, but you never know. I had one time, we were working on a big 6,000-year-old cemetery, and we had a big block excavation open, and there were all these burials, and you could see them sitting around that we were working on in different stages of excavation. And we had public come out to visit the archaeologist day, and people came out to look at while we were working. And this woman comes out and announces that she is a psychic, right? And she makes a big deal out of this. And I remember her standing on the edge of the block, and she's got her eyes closed, and she goes, "I feel a great sadness here." I'm like, really? In a cemetery? I'd have never guessed. So anyway, I don't know. You got, go ahead, Bruce.
Well, a few years ago, Jim and I were in Jerusalem on a tour trip, and we went to that location, and it bummed me out. It really did, because we were standing in various places, and you could just feel the buzz of politics.
Yeah.
It just swam in my head, and I think I said to Jim, I gotta get out of here. This is really creeping me out. And I got home, and I came in and talked to Charlie about it.
Uh-huh.
And I remember Charlie's comment was, "Oh, Ruth, I'm so sorry we let you go on that trip. I should have prepared you for that."
Yeah.
And I thank you for doing this, because I wish I had known a little more of this before we did that. Because it made me and the whole trip, they would tell, this happened here on this day. This happened here on, and I kept wanting to say, how do you know that? We don't know that.
Very good. You already, you're ahead of the curve. How would you know? Is that something
my
you...
archaeology brain was working, I
Right.
guess.
Could you know that, right?
How could you know that?
Yeah. So go ahead, Jim.
There was a slab out that was supposedly where they prepared the bodies.
That's right. They
And
do have a slab
there was
outside
a
this.
woman there just crying up a storm.
Now, one thing I should add is that around it in the church, they have found some other tombs that have been there that just got kind of walled over, and they have found Christian pilgrimage crosses that appear to go pretty far back. So it looks like Christians were making pilgrimages to this, certainly by the 200s, something like that, to this kind of spot. And so you've got an idea that there was some veneration going on around there. I mean, again, your ultimate problem is that archaeology isn't very good at finding a specific person or an event. How would you rule out? I mean, just to take a Popperian positivist view, of science, which is science. You have to be able to disprove a hypothesis in order for it to be scientific. How would we disprove that this was Jesus' tomb with lack of evidence? We wouldn't be able to. My best hope is that when they pull all the stuff off the Edicule to do a rebuilding, that you might find Christian pilgrimage inscriptions on this rock itself. Now, to me, that would start saying, at least we know that people were coming here early on and venerating the tomb. Was it the actual tomb? I don't know. But at least we would know it was a venerated spot. That's possible. It's also possible that they just shaved them off while they made the Edicule. So yeah, looking at the evidence, it's a tomb of the right type, though it's a bit odd with that angled thing. It's outside the walls. It's located near the possible Golgotha rock. Seems to be where Christians remembered it. Hadrian built a temple over it. Why did he do that? Exact date of the tomb constructions are known. No other evidence for the burial of Jesus. So yeah, what do you think? And that's during a big Easter fire, new fire ceremony, which is really kind of a cool thing that I'd love to see. I doubt just any person gets in here on Easter.
That I would have enjoyed.
Yeah, exactly. It is unfortunate. I mean, it's just you've got these different orders, they're all squabbling amongst themselves. And in fact, the really thing that I find funny is that there's one person who keeps the key to the church, and he's Muslim. Because he's the only one they trust to do it. So that's it. We got a little bit of time for questions, so anything pop in your head, comments, questions? Jim?
The Bible covers many modern countries. Do the authorities in these various countries have different attitudes to the biblical aspects of their archaeology?
Well, it is contentious, right? And I would actually say, almost no science is free of politics. That, political things, interests affect funding, affect, who gets what, who gets permission to work in a place or using particular data. In the American West right now, there's arguments over who descends from those cliff dwellings. Is it the modern Pueblos? Is it the Navajo? The Navajo are making claims that they descend from that. It's a little hard for me to believe because they don't live in communal apartments like that right now. They all live in little isolated hogans. And the people who lived in those apartments buried the dead in the floor, and Navajo are really not happy about dead bodies. I don't know all the details about differing things, but yes, interpretations get contested, locations are contested, archaeological evidence is used to try to demonstrate the antiquity of the Jewish homeland and where it was and what areas were. And it's just very difficult frequently because, like I said, it's not real good at finding specific people, specific events. It's really even hard to use to find a culture, a people, because how is that reflected in material culture? Well, sometimes there's things that are associated with that, sometimes not. And so it is often contested. What I will say is that all over the Near East, and especially in Israel, they got great archaeological protection laws. The antiquities belong to the state, even if it's on your private land. So you find something, you have to call them in. In the U.S., your private land, you're not getting a federal permit or anything, you can wipe it out. Go ahead, Don.
This is really kind of a lazy person's question because I'm asking you to update me on a book I read 20 years ago. But it was by two Israeli archaeologists, and they were looking at the Old Testament, archaeological evidence for the Old Testament. And they basically kind of said the following. Yes, there's evidence that some of the cities mentioned existed at the time. Yes, there's evidence that some cities existed, but they didn't exist at the time it was being described. And for some cities, you can't find them at all. And they end up concluding that most of the Old Testament was written during a time when the Jewish state was on its ascendancy in terms of power, and that much of the Old Testament was written by theologians who were kind of trying to justify or explain. I don't know if I'm guessing there's new archaeological evidence from that time?
That's generally still what I have read as the overall idea about the dating and time of at least the final assembly of the what we call the Old Testament, the Torah, the writings, the prophets, or the more updated is, especially the Torah. Maybe that happened during the Babylonian exile, was a time when that was sort of all brought back together, but all that other stuff is true. So Jericho, we know where Jericho was. Have we been able to find the walls that were blown down? No. You know, it's now cities in the Near East. You think of Troy. They would flourish for a while and then either just catch on fire, which was very common because their roofs are straw and things like that. So fire was really destructive. Or there'd be an earthquake, or they'd get wiped out by somebody. And boy, a lot of times when they wiped you out, they flattened the place. I mean, it wasn't just like a, take over the politics. They just flattened the whole city. And then people would come back and build on top of it again, and it ultimately builds up this big mound. And you can trench that sucker and look at the profile, and it's complicated and it's a mess. I won't go into that now, but you can sort out the different occupations. But think again what I was talking about radiocarbon dating. You can get radiocarbon dates. You can even see like a burn layer of where all the roofs got burned. You can date that. Oh, nice. What's your target event there is the end of that occupation, and you've got burned evidence. But the problem is you get a wide error range. It's hard to use the biblical text to narrow down a date range because it's more of a theological and political text than it is a historical text. So correlating that, and so some biblical archaeologists used to spend a lot of time arguing over, I think Jericho 7a, that's the one, it's very hard to say. So again, very difficult to identify a specific event. Go ahead, Susan.
So I'm struggling with how I should think about all the archaeological evidence in spiritual terms. As history or as science, this is great and it's really interesting. But from a spiritual perspective, I almost want to say, I don't want to know the exact subject, right, of the Holy Sepulchre. And actually, I think it's kind of problematic if we're able to identify it. So maybe I just want to sort of put this all aside from that perspective. I mean, as someone who was both a professional archaeologist and a priest, I'm wondering how you put these things together.
Yeah, well, that's a very good point, and maybe really the essence of it. I think a couple of things. I think actually fundamentally you're right. Like our faith, our understanding of who Jesus was, what Jesus was all about, how that relates to what God does in creation has nothing to do with history. It doesn't matter to me whatsoever. My faith isn't based on whether something in the Bible historically happened or not, even though I would say probably many things probably did, some things probably didn't, some things happened in ways that were slightly different. If that's the tomb of Jesus, I'm not really perturbed by whether it is or whether it isn't. My faith isn't based on that. I'm far more interested in Jesus the Christ than I am in Jesus of Nazareth, the historical fellow who walked around. I'm more interested in the theological Jesus than the historical one. I do think that this type of work, first of all, I love the stuff about context that can enlarge our understanding of biblical text by providing what we can see as a historical social context. I love that kind of stuff. Helps you understand the letters, the Gospels better, I think, and make better interpretations of what was there. I think, I always think of the actual, what we can confirm with science, helps us to differentiate between what is faith and what is, what we think is historical or actually occurred. And I always think that that's very good, to be very aware that I believe this on faith, right? Not because it's correlated with something that I can prove. And I think I always feel like that stuff, interacts with my faith to kind of, shape it a little bit, help me understand it a little bit. I often say all of archaeology is basically constrained interpretation. It's different from a field like physics where you can replicate an experiment over and over again. You can't really replicate an experiment on the past. You dig it up, it's gone. Whatever it was you dig up, you've destroyed while you excavated. So it's an interpretive science. You interpret, and it's constrained by the data, right? You can't just make any old story up, right? Because you do have data. We do know things now because of archaeology. Nobody thinks that humans evolved only in Europe or all over the world. They evolved in Africa. We know that. That's nailed down. There's no question about it. So, you know, in the same way, like, you know, the interaction between the whatever we can determine of the history and what the documents are saying theologically is very interesting to me. To me, it's just like one more way of looking at my faith. I got maybe time for one more. So Nate, you've been very patient.
Oh, Susan asked my question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, why does it matter?
Well, hang on, Jim. You've had one. David was asking.
I'll take it back. Well, you answered, but Susan asked my question.
Oh, okay. All right. So, Jim, you get the last question.
All right. I have encountered magazines, biblical archaeology, and one I found quite interesting was the discovery of Herod's tomb, which was kind of down the hill from Masada, but before you get to the Dead Sea. So
it does happen, and it usually happens if we've got corroborating historical evidence, and the tombs are pretty good. Sometimes they'll inscribe names on them, or they'll have a particular form that we can identify as being a royal sort of thing. So that helps identify a specific person. What I would say, I'm glad you brought that up. What I would say in terms of like popular magazines, Biblical Archaeology Review, BAR, is really not bad. In fact, I would say that they're generally careful in how they report stuff, and that's not a bad place to kind of get some popular archaeology, biblical archaeology information. I would say stuff that PBS does is really generally not bad. I would steer away from like Discovery Channel, or there's been a real sort of explosion of adventurous archaeologists, and a guy flies in a hang glider or something, and that stuff is awful generally. I mean, really, it's bad. It's bad archaeology. It's not how archaeology is done. It's entertaining television, but it's really generally awful. And like anybody with a camera can, and I don't know, boots and a hat can claim to be an archaeologist. So, I mean, those types of sources I think are good. Archaeology Magazine, in general, I would say is not bad. That's a pretty good popular one. And then if you know, often, like, it's not too terribly difficult to read an actual archaeological journal. It'll be kind of dense, might even be really boring. Generally, it's going to be really boring because they're trying to make it peer review proof, right? Which those of you who publish know what that does to your writing. It just, you know, you get really careful, and careful is boring. So, you know, and archaeologists are very careful about the claims they make. And sometimes I think archaeologists, we've had a tendency to be too careful. Because every now and then, you know, we'll find something that, let's take Otzi the Iceman. Do you hear about this guy? Frozen up at the top of the Alps, Bronze Age dude, lots of preservation of stuff on him, and guess what? It matched what we thought they were like carting around and carrying, and the hypotheses we had about people's movements. It's like, wow, we were right, you know, like, or there's archaeologists who have hypotheses about how stone tools were made, how people moved around and used those stone tools. And in Utah, while I was out there, they found a cache, just like somebody had hidden their little toolkit. And boy, it was exactly like we thought they would do it, right? And so part of me has gone like, you know, we should maybe, you know, give ourselves some credit every now and then and not be quite so careful, you know. David?
Well, it's not a question, but I think, I for one, and I'm sure everyone wants to thank you for these special
Yes, thank you. Yes, I should. I do have another service. Thank you all. Next week, bell choir, so it's going to be great.